Um, I would like to first thank Suzie for coming and doing this and being here with us today. I would also like Suzie to tell you a little bit about her background briefly and how she got to where she is. Wow, what a gorgeous photo. So Suzie, I'm going to turn it over to you. So I can hear some, if everyone could mute themselves, I mean, I guess I can mute everyone. If you could mute themselves, and Sue, if you could unmute yourself, that would be stellar.
Was I muted?
100%. So you need to start again.
No worries. Okay. Hey, everybody. My name is Suzie. I believe it or not, use Zoom quite frequently, but I guess can't figure it out today. I am located down in Stonington, Connecticut, which is right on the Rhode Island, Connecticut border. We actually live right on the Pawcatuck River, which is the river that separates westerly Rhode Island and Stonington, Connecticut. We're pretty much the southeasternmost point of the state of Connecticut. And I own and operate Stonington Kelp Company with my husband, Jay. It is a 10-acre leased site where we grow sugar kelp in the Fisher's Island Sound. It's kind of the last piece of the Long Island Sound before it flows out into the Atlantic Ocean. So the picture that you see on the screen is actually some underwater footage from earlier this year. No, that's not true. It's 2022. It's from 2021, taken by the person who farmed with me last year, Elizabeth Ellenwood, who is currently in Norway doing a Fulbright scholarship that got kind of kicked down the road during COVID. So I was very lucky to have her with me. This is our actual site. You can see the strength of the current in the area where we grow our sugar kelp, which definitely makes the farm site a little bit more dangerous for us as we're farming, but it increases the amount of nutrients that flow over the seaweed, which makes it a really ideal place for us to grow kelp in our site. I think that this really captures just kind of how much energy is in the water. All right. So this is what we grow. This is your kind of standard brown algae. It is native to the Long Island Sound all the way up to the shores of Nova Scotia. It likes cold water. The kind of breakdown of the seaweed, we have the holdfast, which acts as essentially the anchor for the seaweed. In the wild, it's going to grow on any sort of substrate. So it can grow on rocks, it can grow on a reef, it can grow on shipwrecks, it grows on the back of clams and certain bivalves. And then you have the stipe, which looks a lot like a stem. It is edible. It is really delicious when pickled. And then you have the blade. And the blade is, for the most part, what I am harvesting and selling to folks for food. In this image, you see, you'll notice a couple things. Number one, the seaweed is very ruffled. And that ruffling is an adaptation that the seaweed, that the sugar kelp will do to kind of increase the amount of surface flow that the water is shoving all over itself. That's how the seaweed is getting nutrition from the water column. It doesn't really have anything to do with the holdfast or the stipe, unlike what we call terrestrial plants. So in areas where there is not a lot of current, not a lot of energy, the seaweed tends to be more roughly to increase the amount of increase the amount of water that's flowing over the surface of the blade. In areas where the seaweed is growing that's very high energy, like my site, the seaweed tends to be a little bit smoother. You'll have less ruffling, and it grows to be a little bit more narrow. It doesn't grow to be as wide. And that's actually a great picture of what it looks like on my site. And I'm just going to click back and hopefully give nobody vertigo, but you can see kind of how much ruffling is in this standard blade. And I want to point out also that long stripe that you're seeing down the center of the blade, and you can also see it in this photo, is the reproductive tissue. That's called the sorus tissue. And this year we had, so when we harvest our when we outplant our seaweed, we're taking already started seaweed blades, right? They're 1 millimeter long. And what we do is we go out, we scuba dive for source tissue in the early autumn, late spring, which is all dependent on water temperature. And then we take that source tissue back to a hatchery or a nursery and kind of induce the sporification process. And because of the very, very warm waters that went into the autumn this year, we had a really late start. We could not find any samples of wild source tissue. So it was actually pretty problematic for my season. Right now, I'm about 10 inches behind average in terms of growth of my seaweed blades. So just another interesting observation from the seaweed farm that hopefully does not require us to kind of readjust how we approach farming every year. And it was all directly related to the warmer waters that we had in our area. I'm gonna just skip over. Well, actually, this is kind of neat. This is Dr. Drew Baker. She was an English phycologist who studied. She studied laver, which is a seaweed that's native to England. And she figured out a stage in the life cycle of seaweeds that actually allowed the nori seaweed farmers in Japan to reestablish their seaweed beds, which had been decimated by typhoon after typhoon. Essentially, what she discovered was the first steps in how we can cultivate seaweed in tanks, how we can encourage that kind of sporification process and grow. So right now, I have to contend with weather. I have to contend with warming waters. I have to contend with water quality, but I don't have to worry about actually getting the seaweed to spore. All of that happens inside of a lab, and all of that is based on the research that Dr. Drew Baker had executed. And so she was actually fired from the institution where she taught because she got married. But she never set foot in Japan. However, her work was so important to the nori farmers in Japan, which is a huge part of their industry, that every year in April, I think it's April 14th, they have a day, they have a huge celebration. They have a monument to her here, and they refer to her as the mother of the sea. And I just think it's really cool that all of the work that she did kind of in her lab essentially moved an industry forward across the world. And I love the fact that she is still honored. And I hope one day to be able to go out and see the celebration that they have for her. So this is my farm. I don't know how familiar you are all with this area, but the little orange triangle in the bottom left-hand corner, adjacent to the eelgrass grounds, is where we have our aquaculture lease set up. We grow in an approved aquaculture site. So I am amongst a lot of other commercial fishermen when I'm out in the water. Not as many in the winter, which is when I farm, but they are still kind of the only other boats I see. Our site is around, on average, 7 feet in depth. Our gear is all permitted through the Army Corps of Engineers. The permitting process takes around anywhere between 18 to, I'd say, 30 months in the state of Connecticut. Seaweed is not federally regulated, so it is state to state. Connecticut has a well-streamlined process, but we are very heavily regulated, maybe one of the most regulated states in the Northeast. So we grow kind of as far out as we're growing, and which is very close to the state lines of New York and Rhode Island, the water state lines of New York and Rhode Island, because we wanted to be out of people's line of sight so that they couldn't or wouldn't be, they wouldn't feel obligated to complain about, seeing us on the working waterfront. There have been a lot of issues with people trying to get aquaculture leases too close to shore because they were disrupting the views of the people who summer in those areas. This is a shot of what the seaweed farm looks like from the surface. A lot of what's happening is happening underwater. You are essentially operating, this is a schematic of the farm. So you have anchors set down to the ground, you have buoys attached to those anchors, and then you're suspending a horizontal line about 3 to 6 feet beneath the water surface. And on that horizontal line is where your seaweed is growing. So the holdfasts will be attached to that horizontal line. The sites are also marked with navigation buoys for safety. If a boat went across the seaweed farm, if they weren't, there could be a lot of dangerous implications, not just to our farm, but you could very easily entangle yourself in a prop. If these sites are, my site, as I mentioned, is very high energy. So that could be, it could be deadly. So we make a big effort to make sure that the sites are very clearly marked. Everything is run through all of the federal channels. So, we're trying our best to make sure that it's not just our gear is not just protected, but that the safety of all the other boaters are protected. As I mentioned before, seaweed grows. We grow our seaweed over the winter. Now, the kelp exists in the water year round. You'll find it all summer long, in addition to all winter long. However, we can grow a cleaner product that people actually want to eat over the winter months because there's less competition in the water. This is another drawing of the seaweed farm. And I kind of feel like both of these are very misleading because, as I mentioned, the water is never still. The water is never sitting still this way. So the seaweed is always getting pulled with the tide in one direction or the other. This is a more accurate, I think, reflection of what the farm is actually going to look like. That's a 1/2-inch rope. The seaweed is growing off of that rope. What I do is I bring my boat alongside of the rope in an area where there is not a large mass of seaweed growing. And then I will pull it onto a cleat and kind of walk myself over to wherever I want to start harvesting. You can see in this photo that I had done a little bit of harvesting, and those are the stipes that are remaining on the line already. A cool thing about my crop is that it regenerates. So if I go out to the farm and I cut a seaweed blade about 10 inches below the stipe, if I return a week later, I'm going to have another perhaps 10 to 12 inches of growth. So it's kind of like hair. So there are different techniques that I'll take in terms of over the course of the season to increase the biomass, like to increase the yield of my farm. Sometimes I will prune, every 2 feet in order to allow more sunlight to hit certain parts of the farm. Sometimes I'll go and just do a full trim of the seaweed farm to allow it to continue to regenerate. I don't cut all the way up to the stipes until it's the very end of the season. And I should also mention, I also harvest to order. So the infrastructure for processing seaweed, well, let me reverse a little bit. The seaweed lives in water it's happiest when it's in water that's below 55 degrees. So I leave it in the ocean as long as I possibly can, because then I don't have to pay for refrigeration. It also is best for the seaweed. There is a lot of the Maine farmers will harvest their crops in one day, and then they bring those crops right back to the docks, and they can hand it over directly to a value add company who will take it and process it. The seaweed, when it comes out of the ocean, needs to be kept cold. In Connecticut, we're regulated just like fish. So you imagine how long a fish is allowed to stay out of water, in certain conditions. Apply that same logic in handling for the seaweed. So there is a lot of infrastructure in Maine because they have a more robust fishing industry, and they also have a historic rockweed industry, which is another type of seaweed. We do not have that in southern New England. So in order for me to make a profit on my farm, we harvest to order and sell directly to chefs, or we sell it directly to institutions. Like UMass Maritime was a big customer of mine. Dartmouth. There was a couple actually within the UMass school system. The cafeterias would use it for smoothies and various other applications. So harvesting to order tends to be a little bit less backbreaking, but it does require that I go out to my farm very frequently, which for me is absolutely fabulous. It's like the best of both worlds, because there's nothing better than being out on a boat in the early spring, late winter in this area. This is another shot of the seaweed just kind of flowing along. If you notice the water color here, this is not edited in any way. The water quality where we are is absolutely bananas. Like, it is so incredibly nice. We measure, we take measurements, we take water samples, and we submit them to various different institutions every year, depending on who would like to partner with us. This year, we're doing work with Woods Hole. We've done a lot of work with Yukon in the past, and oddly enough, University of Fairbanks in Alaska. And so we measure water samples. We submit tissue samples of the seaweed to kind of get a sense of what's going on within each, on the farm, what the seaweed is absorbing from the water. And we measure turbidity. And you can see on my site, it around 20 feet below the surface. So when we put that Secchi disc down there to kind of get a sense of how, what the water clarity is like, it's always nice and very clear. I mentioned our average depth is around 25 feet. So we're pretty close to our gear. It would be, it would be great if we could actually see the gear, because then I could, learn a lot of other things and actually, collect anything that possibly went derelict a lot easier. But 20 feet, I still think is pretty impressive. Now we send tissue samples to various different labs for nutritional profiles and things along that. But each year we also send tissue samples to our Department of Agriculture and to the Bureau of Aquaculture, where they test the seaweed for heavy metal content. The farm absorbs carbon and nitrogen out of the water. Essentially, we're farming carbon and nitrogen, and as we move it out of the ocean, we're removing it. We're taking it out of the water through the seaweed. Because seaweed grows so fast, and because it's taking everything out of the water in order to grow, if you grow it in an area that has high heavy metal flows going through it, it will also absorb that. It can absorb the sketchy stuff as well as the stuff you want it to take out. So we do sample our seaweed every year. We do grow our seaweed in an approved aquaculture site that has an A rating for their water quality scorecard. So it's not ever usually a concern, but it is a nice thing to know and feel confident in every year, because like I said, we primarily sell for food. So I'm feeding it to my kids. Like, I'm eating a ton of it myself. I kind of don't want to put that in my body. This is what it looks like when we outplant. This is actually, this was a couple years ago. This is a beautiful spool sample. You don't get them as roughly as this, but what you're looking at is tiny, tiny little kelp blades that are wrapped around, it's around 250 feet of kite string that's tightly wound around that PVC pipe. And in the hatchery, what we do is we take that kite string and PVC pipe, we call it a spool, and that goes into the tank with nothing on it. So it's all white. The kite string's white, the PVC pipe is white. When the sporification process takes place in the tank, the only thing that the seaweed can attach to is the kite string. So that's kind of how we encourage it to grow where we want it to grow, so we can transport it out to the ocean. And what I do is, I hate this picture of my husband. He looks like a prisoner in the back. So what I do is we untie one of the horizontal lines that we have suspended between two mooring balls. We untie it from the mooring. We feed that line through the PVC pipe. And then I'll take a piece of the kite string and I actually splice it. You can see me splicing it right into the line. And then we just unfurl it and it just curls around the PVC pipe as we slowly walk or power the boat alongside. And I think here you might be able to actually just see the process. So you can see that right there. And it's a pretty simple process. It's oddly enough, it's easy to mess up. There's a couple of things you have to make sure that the line, the kite string is going along in the same direction as the rope, like that the braids are going in the same direction, because that'll allow the holdfasts to kind of get a better grip of the rope. I've also learned that the fresh rope the holdfasts don't take to fresh line as well as they take to line that I've already used out in the water. They like it a little bit rougher. But that's it. This is the outplanting process. And then we'll do this over the course of the entire farm. We have multiple different arrays. We do it for, 8 to 16 different sections of the farm. And once it's outplanted, other than checking our gear, taking measurements, observing, you don't really do anything. I joke around and I say that the farm grows in spite of me. I can't grow anything else. I can't even grow grass. So this is a huge joy for me to actually be successful in cultivating a crop. So I mentioned before, the seaweed farm started as an effort to do something positive for the environment, as well as try to create a food that was extremely healthy. When we looked into, when we live on a marina, we operate a marina in the summer months. So this is a great kind of dovetail business for my family. And when we, started considering, now that we have access to the water and we can leave our boat in year round if we'd like to, what sort of cool things could we do? We came across the idea of just cultivating seaweed for ourselves, just kind of as a garden. Because of the stringent permitting process, because you're growing seaweed in, a shared resource, that made absolutely no sense. But we did learn more about the potential economic, benefits this could have. And it's a really new market. I do a lot more marketing and education than I actually do farming. That's okay, because I also like talking about seaweed in addition to being out on the boat. But it is a really, really young industry, and there's not a lot going on in Southern New England. Like I said, in Maine, they kind of have a system up and running, but it's not, because of our lack of infrastructure, it's not really something that can be replicated without very heavy capital investments in the area. But there's a lot of great studies that have been done about the impacts that seaweed has on our local waterways, which is another wonderful reason to encourage this industry to grow, as long as it's growing responsibly. And there's also a lot of research going into the health impacts of seaweed. So, it's something to keep an eye out for sure. UConn just did a great study about seaweed, the benefits of seaweed. They used our farm seaweed, so we got to see the pre-published version of this study. But it talked about how seaweed can help aid in weight loss. So that was exciting. Still, my anecdotal evidence has proven that to not be true. But this is essentially what harvesting looks like. It's very simple. You just lift the line up. You don't even need a crane. You just lift the line up and cut the seaweed off with a knife, or even a pair of I have a pair of cooking scissors that I use. They're made out of plastic, so they don't rust. And in an effort to kind of develop the market, I'm the co-founder of a cooperative of Southern New England sugar kelp farmers. In Massachusetts, I think that there are 2 permitted farms right now. There might be a third that just went in. Rhode Island has 3 permitted farms with gear in the water. And then in Connecticut, we have 3 permitted commercial farms, and then there are I believe 3 permitted nonprofit farms, research farms. And now the state of New York is starting to grow the seaweed industry. So while that infrastructure doesn't exist and that marketing side kind of doesn't exist just yet, we found that since we're all similar in size and in ability to produce, we've been trying to work together to leverage our collective biomass to, appeal to larger accounts, if you will, so we can kind of sell to different value add companies as a group. It's a way to kind of protect ourselves. If I have a customer who wants a recurring order, but there's a nor'easter blowing through, I might be able to get one of my fellow farmers who don't have such a treacherous site to fill in these orders. So it's a great way for us to start to establish ourselves and develop a confidence and rapport with our restaurant partners. And then we also put on the New England Kelp Harvest Weeks, which is just it's kind of like a restaurant week that we do up Rhode Island and Connecticut, where we're trying to get restaurants to feature, from April 20th to May 1st, some sort of locally cultivated seaweed item on their menu. And we did it with success last year. And so now we're going to be expanding. We have more farmers that are part of our cooperative. And so, hopefully that'll expand our reach in terms of restaurants who want to join on. And these are just some of the images of neat things people have created with the seaweed that we've grown, including, I mentioned the stipes before on the bottom right-hand corner. That is pickled stipes, and they're just one of my favorite things to eat. You can eat them right out of the ocean, and you can eat seaweed right out of the ocean. But when you have the pickled stipes, it's like the most amazing thing to put in like a Bloody Mary. You can even do a nice martini with the brine and then garnish it with the stipes. And then Melissa Clark from the New York Times did this roasted chicken recipe, and then, clams linguine. It's a very versatile food product. It brings a big, it packs a mean punch when it comes to the amount of nutrients that it brings to your plate. It also is considered an umami flavor. So you can dry it and use it as a seasoning to kind of enhance that kind of savory flavor of any of your dishes. You can use it as a pasta substitute, so it can be a noodle. You can kind of cut it down to size. It holds up well in sauces because it's naturally, it's used to being in the water, so it can handle kind of that like liquid component. And then we eat it in a lot of salads as well in my house. I'd say that the way that I sneak it into my kids' diet though is by drying it out and just using it as like a salt substitute because they don't know it's there. And boom, I just added a bunch of iron and calcium to their dish without having to hear any talk back. Another thing the cooperative is trying to get going is we're trying to partner with larger organizations to have them sponsor a seaweed line. So we can pay a farmer for their the garbage, the byproduct of their farm, so the end of the crops, which they have to take off anyway. And then we'll take that seaweed, we'll dry it out, and then we'll deliver it to one of our local land farmers. And we'll help them use it as a soil input. It's considered an organic soil input. It's very high in nitrogen because it pulled a lot of that out of the ocean. And it is a alternative to the chemical nitrogen fertilizers, which can be problematic when they run off into local waterways. So this is a way to kind of stop that cycle by using all of the byproduct. And we're, working with institutions to try to get them on board with using this as a way to kind of check the box for their corporate and social responsibility obligations that they promise to their employers. So it's a kind of game of trying to figure out where are the markets and the various different channels that we as farmers can use to help us keep going. It's really kind of barely a break-even business if you're just trying to sell to value-add companies like they do in Maine, or if you're just trying to sell to restaurants. It's a whole lot of hustling. So as a cooperative, we're trying to work together to establish these channels to do things that are great for the entire industry rather than just the individual farmer. And I'm finding too that like most of the people who get into this tend to have that same sort of mindset. I am sure that will change as soon as we can figure out a way to model this to be economically viable. The sharks will come swimming, but that's where we are right now. And it's really fun to kind of be in a bit of a kumbaya space as we try to figure it all out. And yeah, this is just about our kind of farmer sponsorship. And this is another image that my friend / farmhand Liz took of the farm. Also, we had a lot of fun last year with the GoPro, and she had become scuba certified. So there was a lot of fun diving, but you can see the length of the stipes. That changes year over year. I can't kind of count on how long my stipes are going to be. We had a great year for stipes last year, and that's something that a lot of chefs get really excited about. I never harvest them until I'm ready to take my farm out of the water, because as I mentioned before, the seaweed will regenerate for me up until that point. And I think that is it. I mean, and so do you have questions? Is there anything that I can try to clear up for you?
Hey, Suzie. Thanks so much. That's pretty exciting stuff. My question for you is, how large is your farm? Like how many acres?
My farm is 10 acres. It's, unless you're going out pretty far into the ocean, it's hard to get permitted for a site that meets all of the natural conditions that you would like to meet, as well as the getting the social license for a farm that's much larger than that. Even in Maine, where, like I said, they're much more established. They have a stronger commercial fishing culture. The sites that were, leases that were requested for, 100 acres were fought back against pretty hard.
Thanks.
Suzie, there was a question in the chat from Anne asking about, I forgot the question. It was how did you go about identifying your site?
Site selection is really important. And I think that like the way that it happens and the way that it should happen are different. And maybe one day they will be a little bit closer. They will be more aligned. But so first of all, Greenwave, I don't think it's out yet. Greenwave is a nonprofit that's based in New Haven, Connecticut. And one of their one of the main things that they do is help seaweed farmers, aspiring seaweed farmers, small and medium farmers, get going. So we partnered with Green Wave early back in 2016 when they were much, much smaller and trying to figure out how they were going to be structured as an organization. So we kind of got away. We had like a personal buddy helping us outplant our farm between Bren and Kendall. Nowadays, they were smart and they became more efficient, and they created a farmer toolkit. So if you are an aspiring farmer, you can go onto this platform that you can access through the Greenwave site, and you can kind of input like where you want to have the farm, how much you're interested in growing, and it kind of gives you suggestions of gear, site location, expected yield, things like that. I think it's live. If it's not live now, it's going to be live soon. But so what we kind of took the information that we had, which at the time was not very much, and looked at a map and essentially just kind of plopped our finger down where we thought it would work. The things we had to consider were, we had to consider what was going on the ocean floor. You don't want to impact any protected species. In our instance, eelgrass. We are around a lot of eelgrass, and you don't want to mess with eelgrass. It is very finicky. So the last thing you want to do is drop gear in that area or shade it so that it can't get access to the light. So that was one thing to consider. You want to, your ideal conditions would be maybe a sandy bottom. You need something where you can definitely get your anchors to hold. You need the depth. I say that's kind of qualified. In Long Island, they're proving that you don't actually need the depth. They have a lot of sites that are walkable. You can walk out to your sites in a pair of waders. But for us, at the time we were permitting, we needed the depth. It was recommended, 30 feet on average. And you need to be in approved aquaculture water. So you need to be in an area that the site is already approved for, not conditionally, but like fully approved aquaculture site. And so that, when you're kind of checking off all of these things, your window of, or I should say your options start to kind of limit themselves. And so for us, we also moved out as far away as possible from the channel and from the shores of Stonington, Connecticut, without leaving the state waters, in order to protect ourselves from, or in an attempt to protect ourselves from the residents of the local shoreline, kind of pushing back. And there's been multiple farms that have been shut down in our area through the permitting process because they were within eyesight of people who did not understand what was happening and didn't necessarily want to see the people out working on their boats over the course of the winter. That being said,
sorry, I just want to Suzie, there's 3 questions, just so you know. I just want to be sure we get to everyone. So.
Yeah. But I should say that testing the water probably should be the first thing somebody does, which we didn't do. And we really we lucked out because we happened to grow our seaweed in an area that has the right amount of nutrients in it to grow a prolific crop every year.
So I want to go back, Stephanie, Dante, Mark.
Hi, Suzie. Thank you so much. This has been a really helpful talk. My question is just about, at the beginning of the talk, you were talking about the scuba diving for the tissues every year. And then later on, you were talking about how you can cut the kelp and it regenerates. So I'm just wondering, can you kind of save those and do it next season? Or why do you go diving every season? Thank you.
So it's because nobody has been able to successfully save it. We can, I've taken it, we try to figure out how it can, do we deep freeze it? What can we do to try to hang on? Cause I get kick-ass source tissue on my farm every year, but we haven't been able to save it yet. So the wild harvest is still a big part of how we seed our crops every year. And the kelp beds are starting to creep further and further east. So that might be a problem. And there is research that's being done at Woods Hole, for instance, where they're trying to establish, they're just looking at different, types, different ways to cultivate seaweed that would allow them to, maybe just kind of grow it all in a lab. I like the idea of wild harvesting because it's a little bit more romantic, but I might be forced to at some point to get, my seed stock from from Massachusetts. Right now, there's also regulations about where I can get seed stock from. So there's certain approved wild kelp beds that I can go out to and get the wild seed stock.
Stephanie?
Thank you. Thanks, Suzie. I had a question about the outplanting. You mentioned that well, what I understood was that you're planting kind of maybe in the fall for winter harvest, and you had said that you plant 6 to 8 or 6 to 16, 8 to 16 sections at a time. So I was just wondering, like, do you stagger your planting, or are you like outplanting everything at once?
We outplant everything at once. It's usually like a huge panic of, you know, the seaweed is ready to go. Like it's ready to get out of the nursery. It's ready to go out into the ocean. And we need to make sure that the wind conditions are safe, that the water temperatures of the ocean are below a certain level, but the ambient temperature is above a certain level, and the wind has to be like flat ass calm. So we outplant everything at once just because we're not sure when we're going to meet all of those conditions. But usually we get a good day. We try to do it around Thanksgiving. This year we didn't outplant until New Year's Eve. We were actually out on the farm planting everything.
Okay, so when you had said that you plant like 8 to 16 sections or something, so do you plant a different, like every season, a different amount of your farm, or
Yeah,
different
like
parts
so
of the farm?
some seasons I've scaled back, and some seasons I've grown. Like, so you know, when we started, we went really big, and we realized we didn't have any place for the seaweed to go at the end of the season. And you can't just cut it off and let it sink to the ocean floor. Like, my responsibility is to take it all out of the water. So you know, you're just trying to balance out, like, do you have a market for it?
Gotcha. Okay, thank you.
Then we've got in the chat, Dante, Mark, Lucas, and then back to Dre.
Yeah, so I saw the question that Dante asked about the fouling. Dante, there's nothing I can do to keep fouling off of my crops. If it fouls, unfortunately. So when I mentioned we're going out and we're checking, you know, we're going out and checking the farm prior to harvest. So I don't start harvesting until like the end of March, beginning of April. I'll check the farm once a week, and I'm looking out to see if there's a bunch of fouling. And I'm, you know, fingers crossed the seaweed will outcompete whatever other algae is growing on there. But if there's fouling, that will impact the yield that I have, and that allows me to kind of make some guesses, really, because it's not very mathematical, about how much seaweed I can promise to certain customers that I have. So yeah, so fouling can be problematic, and that's another reason why a lot of times the farms, you know, there's a recreational use of the waterways that increases in the June timeframe, but also once the ocean waters start to warm up, everything else is also coming to life again. So like, you know, shellfish are spawning, and there's a lot of other algae, and there's sea squirts, and there's epiphytes that start growing. So, I mean, the seaweed then also will start to foul. So your farm is essentially done, you know, by the beginning of May in this area. The biggest barriers to growth and expansion, which is a question Mark asked, are really I think the lack of infrastructure. If I had the ability to take my seaweed back to shore and process it somewhere close by, it would reduce it would increase, I think, the price per pound that I'm selling. And so being able to stabilize your crop really is the biggest issue for me. But I think that that's going to change soon, you know. And I should say the other thing, a very important barrier that is kind of fun to overcome, is education. A lot of people really don't understand a lot about seaweed, especially seaweed as a food. And so trying to get people really excited about something that is a local, wildly sustainable crop that you could be eating, and it can be used in so many different ways, is it's a challenge, but you know, that's a fun challenge.
Suzie,
yeah.
How do you get chefs? I mean, I've tried too locally. You know, when you think about Chilean sea bass and what the restaurant industry did to that species, right? Driving it down to really low levels, unfortunately. Like, why can't we seem to get that momentum in this seaweed space?
Well, I think we can. I think that so that's part of the reason why I like the cooperative approach rather than just one institution trying to do it all. It's better to be a movement than just like a crazy, you know, rock star individual in order to succeed in this area. And so as a collective of farmers all working together, kind of sharing the same message across a very like a wider swath of chefs, we're starting to see some traction. Like we had some pretty good luck with the sugar kelp harvest week last year, and that was during COVID, and it was just two of us, like two farmers. And we, moved over 5,000 pounds of seaweed because of that. One of the other farmer I worked with was like, I didn't need to sell anything else. Like that alone let my farm break even for the season. So I think that it's a matter of a sustained group effort. It's a marathon, not a sprint for this, for sure.
Great. Okay, Lucas and then Dre.
Yeah, and then Lucas, when I was mentioning less competition, I meant competition with other algae, shellfish, things like that. The boat activity is pretty minimal in the winter in this area, so that's not necessarily a problem. And honestly, the biggest problem for a boat for me would be a boat running across my farm or hitting some of my gear. God forbid hurting themselves. And then was there one more question in the chat or?
No, I don't think so. I think there's Dre is next now.
Thanks. This is awesome. So thank you. Hopefully a quick question is what was your cost to start and what do you think it is now? But also it's just very depressing here in Mass talking to people, and it's very depressing. I'm like, you're never going to make money. It's just, it's really hard. It's really difficult. But where do you want to see the biggest support come from for a market? Do you see public-private partnerships, carbon credits? Like, what do you envision to get the support that you need to do that?
I think that it's like so first of all, Massachusetts, there's Chatham Kelp Company.
Yep.
And then there's Cottage City Oysters. And I would argue that they are both doing well. Like they're making money on, like overall. And I think it's because they do a combination of like they do various different types of aquaculture. They're not just endeavoring in seaweed. And the guys from Cottage City are doubly awesome because they have a very different nutrient flow where they grow their seaweed, and they've just kind of pivoted and used that to kind of specialize what they're growing. Like we have the same seed stock, but our crops look wildly different. And that also introduces kind of a level of terroir too. So my seaweed will taste different from their seaweed as well. So I think that they've done just an absolutely fabulous job. And I highly recommend trying any of their, clams, oysters, scallops, or seaweed if you get an opportunity. I think that it's diversifying your income streams. So while we grow seaweed, that's the only crop that we use. I mentioned that we also run a marina, and my husband also runs a mooring. He services moorings. He has like a marine like barge business. So the costs to start are a little bit different to calculate because we have shared costs that are associated with our other businesses. And that is why, another reason why I think for a lot of the farmers in Maine, it doesn't cost them as much if they're already out lobstering and they're doing their scallop farms and they have the right insurance riders. They have all of the gear that they need to just go out and add this to their whole like repertoire, like to the list of crops that they're growing. And for us, it was somewhat similar. Like we have the boat, we have work boats, we have a barge to service the large equipment. We have access to materials at cost for the farm. I can beg my husband to work for free on the barge for me. And we don't have the overhead of having to pay for a slip. So we have all of those things kind of reducing the cost to start. The gear alone and the seed stock alone is definitely going to set you back somewhere around $10,000 to $12,000. And then if you add on whatever, you have the cost of your lease and your insurance, which is probably like another $1,000. And then you have to kind of factor in any of the overhead around the expenses of either hiring a barge to set your gear or having a boat and then paying for the boat insurance and the slip. So it's those sorts of things. So it can be like kind of I know it's been touted as not a very heavy capital investment, but for sure it is. But if you're sharing it amongst other kind of ventures, like, so for an oyster farmer, this might not cost as much, but for somebody who is starting from scratch, you're going to want some capital. And it's difficult without the push for self-marketing outside of Maine, it's really difficult to find, those guys at Chatham Kelp and Cottage City, they've already been growing oysters. They have a connection with a lot of the restaurants. So for them to transition in was a lot easier.
Suzie, there's 3 more questions in the chat.
Sure.
And I just wanted to say that a couple weeks more into the semester, we do talk about the whole concept of scalability. And scalability doesn't just mean getting bigger. It means what Suzie just said, like, all of the different things they do is part of their business so that they're not completely dependent on this kind of just growing seaweed.
Yeah.
Right.
So while I grow one type of seaweed, what I try to do is look at it from, if you look at the seaweed blade, like each section of the blade could go to a different channel. And so what we're trying to do is diversify the amount of channels we have, as, so some of my seaweed can go for fertilizer and some of it can go for, that kind of farm to table, and some will be stabilized and sold in value add. But the more channels we have, the more a farm can kind of stand on its own 2 feet. So my farm is in its 5th year, and I kind of finally feel like I know what I'm doing, but every year, like again, with like the warming waters and like the difficulty finding source tissue, we get new curveballs, which is really fun. And there was a question that I really liked about the most joyful thing.
Me
So
too.
I did corporate marketing for many years, and I started the seaweed farm when I was still working. I worked from home since 2014, and I started the farm and kind of did both at the same time. And I had my coworkers, whenever we were on Zoom calls or WebExes, they could tell when I was on the farm because they were like, "You look so happy." And that was eventually like when I admitted to myself that this was something I really wanted to do, in spite of its lack of economic dependability. But just being out in the water, growing something, and knowing that even if I can't make the sale, my farm has still improved the local waterways in some way, it's really satisfying. And I feel like I can look my kids in the eye now more than I could before. So I accidentally grow blue mussels on my farm every year. However, unlike Greenwave has a very unique lease. Bren can keep his gear in the water year round. A lot of if I were to grow mussels, for instance, and depend on them as a revenue stream, I would be SOL, because I have to take my gear out of the water and I wouldn't be able to leave the mussels in to mature. So the season is off. The seaweed season is off from a lot of the shellfish seasons. So while you can grow, like I could grow mussels very easily on my farm, it doesn't make commercial sense for us. And that's just because and it's very difficult to get a year-round lease now, because there are so many people who are very concerned about the recreational use of the waterways, and they fear that the gear is going to impact their it's a shared resource. So, their points are valid. But you have to kind of have a long-standing permit. I think that for this industry to grow, if I were Greenwave, I would try to entice more oyster farmers who have existing leases into doing this sort of work. However, all oyster leases are not great for growing seaweed. So like I said, they suggest that 30-foot kind of space, or if you grow oysters and you depurate out in the water, your site is not going to be commercially approved for growing seaweed. So the 3-dimensional farming model is great, but it's not that the Venn diagram of people who would fall into that is very, very, very small in Connecticut and Rhode Island.
Okay.
I have one more, if that's okay.
Sure.
You mentioned a little bit earlier, so you described some of the infrastructure challenges that make so much sense as challenges. And then you said that you think it's shifting. What is happening that makes you optimistic about it shifting? What changes are you seeing? What do you think is going to really support those shifts to create the infrastructure somewhere other than Maine, where it already kind of pre-existed?
Yes. I think that as we get more farmers and as we start to continue developing channels that are within our control without the infrastructure, then we will start producing, as farmers, more mass. And it's like a chicken and the egg. Everybody says that the reason the seaweed industry is not growing in southern New England is because there's not enough supply and stability to sustain a value add company's interest in purchasing large amounts of seaweed from us. So they're saying like, well, I would love to make this product, but I don't have enough farmers who are willing to grow enough. And the farmers aren't willing to grow enough because they don't have enough interest. So what we're trying to do is encourage in the cooperative, we of the cooperative, we're trying to figure out a way to work with what we've got and leverage everything that we possibly can that's within our control right now by selling direct to chefs and selling direct to institutions, the seaweed that comes right out of the ocean. And if we can make enough money and kind of prove that out, I believe that more people would be interested in contributing to Southern New England's collective production of seaweed. And once that happens, I know, because I've talked to a lot of people who are kind of on the fence about investing in these sorts of things, that there would be more interest in considering ways to put infrastructure in place in our region or adapt existing infrastructure for other processing, other types of, fish processing facilities, et cetera. There would be a push to kind of move those things to be more hospitable to seaweed. We need really like the capability to commercially dry or to flash freeze. And those aren't impossible things to get like along the coast. So I think that it can be figured out, but I don't think anybody's going to be willing to figure it out until they know that that stable supply will be there. Otherwise, what we're left with is all of us selling our crops up to Maine for them to use in their value add products. And I have done that in the past, and they're awesome to work with and, wildly helpful, but they pay a very, very low price because a lot of their farmers they harvest differently. Like they're doing that kind of one big harvest and that's the end of it. And so we're not really in sync with them, and it doesn't wind up working out well for our crops. So, but maybe I'm just very Pollyanna about the whole thing, but I really do think that I think it's gonna start to pick up, maybe not this year, but I think that within 3 years, we'll start to have a better sense of how to process in Southern New England.
Thank you. Does anyone else, that was a packed hour, I want to say. Does anyone else have any questions before we let Suzie go? No? Suzie, just so you know, we don't see you. You're there you are. Okay. I know you've got like sunlight.
I know, it's like blaring behind me. I'm so sorry.
Rays all around you and a large seaweed. Leaf. Anyway, thank you so much. I'm really grateful you were here. And I'm sure I did put your email in the chat, so I hope that's okay.
Yeah, that's absolutely fine. Please email me if you have questions. And, I talk very fast, so sorry if it went, right over.
It was great. It's recorded. I'm actually going to stop the recording. So we have it